You don't want that to happen. So be sure to define things the audience may not know. Analogies. Analogies help you to explain information. And this is kind of getting into some English class information or tools that you might use. With an analogy, you explain something the audience is similar with or familiar with to explain to help them to understand what they don't know much about. So let me say that again. You use an analogy in comparing two things. One, the audience knows what it is. You compare that to what the audience is unfamiliar with so that they better understand the unfamiliarity. Two types of analogies, literal and figurative. Now, maybe I have an audience analysis and I know my audience is fairly familiar with things in the United States. I want to talk about the Sahara Desert. Maybe I'll compare it to Death Valley because I know my audience understands how very hot it gets in Death Valley and how very arid and how empty it is. And I explain that. I bring that up in their mind to help them to better understand the Sahara Desert. That's a literal analogy because it's comparing place to place. In a figurative analogy, you're comparing two totally different things. Apples to oranges. So if I want to explain feedback and communication, I might compare it to a thermostat. The way a thermostat works is that you set the number where you want it to be. And then the thermostat reads the air, the room, and it adjusts. It either adds heat to make things warmer, or it adds cooler air to cool things down. So it gets it where it wants to be. When you're communicating, you have a point where you want to be. You want the audience to understand what you're talking about. Feedback and communication is like that. So if I want to get to a point where the audience understands what I'm talking about, and I'm looking and I see people with confused faces, and they're shaking their heads, they're not sure, that's feedback. That lets me know I need to adjust the room. I need to add some information or say this in a different way so people get to the point where I want them to be. If I see that people are nodding and they're in agreement, then I know I'm where I need to be. So you can compare feedback and communication to a thermostat to help the audience to understand. Statistics. Stats can be great. They can help explain information very quickly. They can help the audience to understand. However, a few things to keep in mind. Round off large numbers. If you don't need a specific number, then round it off. And that's just because it's easier to remember. If you do need a specific number, though, use that specific number. Sometimes you need that for impact. So if you need that for impact, then it's fine to use that. Use aids. And it says here visual aids. It can be something on the board like a graph or a chart, things like that to help us to understand. But it can also be things that help us to visually picture that information. For instance, something such as it's the distance between here and California. Or imagine from Cleveland to Ireland. Or it's the equivalent of 20 football fields. I was actually watching a documentary one time where they were talking about an old castle in Ireland. And the person who was commenting on the castle had said when the castle was built, because it was in ruins by now, it was the equivalent, the roof was the equivalent of 20 football fields. Now, they were in England or Scotland or Ireland. They were in the UK. And so they're talking soccer fields instead of football fields, which it's about the same size, slightly different, but similar size. If he would have said it's the size, it was 200 square meters, I would have no clue how big that is. He could have said 200 square feet, and I still would have been like, oh, I guess that's big, but I still can't picture it so quickly. If he says 10 football fields, bam, I got it right away. And I can move on and I keep up with them. So it's important to give the audience that type of information where they can quickly visualize it and move on with you. It's as if in this classroom, 8 of us will have died within 1 year from this disease. So things like that will help us to very quickly picture things and move on. Cite sources. Numbers are not your own. You always need to let us know where you got them from. And don't use too many stats. If you use stat after stat after stat, it just gets to be too confusing. This especially comes up when people want to talk about sports figures. Go beyond the numbers. That's really important. It's not a sports show. So you want to make sure that you are going beyond the numbers, not using too many statistics. Opinions. And here we're talking about opinion. We're not talking about this is what I think about that. We're talking about essentially research that you've looked up with people, things that people say. Expert testimony is the first type of opinion. In 1924, there was a tornado that devastated Lorain. This is actually a picture of Broadway in Lorain, Ohio, after the tornado. Expert testimony will be someone who's an expert in tornadoes. You get information from them. Now, this could be directly talking to them in an interview, or it could be information that you look up that's from them. That expert's a meteorologist, someone who's talking about it because they have a lot of education in that area. That's expert testimony. Lay testimony is not an expert. It's someone who experienced it. So maybe your great-grandma was in that tornado, and she remembers how it was. Quotes from her are called lay testimony. So it's not someone who is an expert in the field, but someone who experienced it. Now, we're talking expert in the field. It doesn't always have to be someone who has a master's degree or PhD in this area. It's just someone who has a lot of experience sometimes. If you want to talk about knitting, and your grandma's been knitting for 50 years, she could be considered an expert. Also, keep in mind, you want to make sure the person actually is an expert. So if your sister's taking nursing classes, and she knows a little bit more about you than in nutrition or in infertility, whatever it may be, she's still not an expert. She's a nursing student. So you're going to someone who's a nurse and has been a nurse for years, or the research that's been written by someone who's a nurse or has been a nurse for years, or an interview for them. So we're talking about expert. Keep in mind who's an expert, who's not. And then lay testimony, again, is the person who's not an expert in the area, but they've experienced it. And then we have literary quotations. Don't use them often. If you're going to use a direct quote, keep it short so that you don't have to read the quote, because when you look down and read, it takes away from your presentation. And again, don't use them frequently. If you have too many quotes, it's just you quoting things. It's not you talking to us. And in extemporaneous speaking, we want you to talk to us and explain information to us in your words. So avoid using too many quotes. And if you're going to use a quote, make sure it's short. You're doing research on all your presentations. Make sure you look in each of the assignments to see what type of research is required, how many references you have to have. But it's not just a presentation on what you think. It's a presentation that has research that backs up what you know.